Fisher then says, the Labor Party will support Britain to the last man and the last shilling, having no idea of what was going to come, of the horrors that were awaiting the world. He makes this incredible commitment.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. At the turn of the 20th century, as a young federation of Australia found its feet, Andrew Fisher rose from the coal mines of Gympie to become Australia's 5th Prime Minister. He served 3 times as Prime Minister, championing groundbreaking reforms from the creation of the Commonwealth Bank, the expansion of pensions and workers' rights, and national infrastructure. He led with a clear sense of purpose, and he steered the nation into World War I and set the tone for Australia's role on the global stage in those early years. He is one of Australia's longest-serving Prime Ministers, and in fact the Labor Party's second longest-serving Prime Minister after Bob Hawke. He was also the first leader in the world to be elected on an avowedly socialist platform. Yet, despite these lasting contributions, Andrew Fisher does remain one of our lesser-known figures in our political memory. So today, to help bring his story to life, I'm joined by renowned historian and biographer of Andrew Fisher, David Day. Welcome to Afternoon Light, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about Andrew Fisher, who gets so little attention.
Look, reading in preparation for today's conversation, David, I was gobsmacked at how little I knew about the accomplishments of Andrew Fisher. And I was also gobsmacked the fact that the Labor Party, his political successors today, still barely talk about him, despite him championing so many of the things that they still to this very day hold dear. So we're righting that wrong a bit on behalf of them and the Australian community. And you wrote this biography, as we were just discussing, in 2008. It's a great contribution to Australia's political history and our memory. But let's start by you explaining who he was, just to paint a picture of Andrew Fisher.
Yeah, well, he was a very Scottish man. Started out in the coal mines as a boy, young boy. Not quite sure how old he was when he first went down the mines, but could have been as young as 9 years old, which wasn't all that unusual. And then became involved in the union, the Coal Miners' Union, and became quite prominent there in Scotland. And then sort of crossed swords with the mine owners and basically got blacklisted and came out to Australia as a young man, sort of to seek his fortune. Australia was the place where things were happening. We'd had the gold rushes. The gold rush in South Africa and Alaska hadn't started yet, but there was a gold rush in Queensland. And so he set his sights on Queensland and came out with his younger brother and became a miner, but very much a unionist as well, and as a Labor leader. And Australia at the time, of course, was leading the world in many ways in terms of its social legislation.
I mean, Australia at that time was known as the working man's paradise, wasn't it? So for a coal miner and a union leader in Scotland, it would have seemed incredibly attractive. Yes. And the wages were really high because, of course, labour was scarce. So if you were willing to work, you were able to demand a very high wage. Much better conditions, of course, than in his home of Scotland. So you can understand the attractiveness of coming to Australia and to Queensland.
Yeah, and there was gold. You could make your fortune.
So he started off in Hervey Bay, didn't he, and then went to the gold mining town of Gympie and became an engine driver. So he wasn't exactly in the thick of the sort of mine shafts. But he had this huge responsibility.
He was on top of the mine shaft. He was running the engine that dropped the miners down the shaft and pulled up the ore. So incredibly responsible job and a well-paid job as well. But I guess it also gave him time to think. I mean, he's not going to be writing and thinking and organising down in the shaft with the other blokes. But up on top there'll be thinking time, presumably, running the machine. And you can go to Gympie now and see a machine that and I actually sat in the machine and saw all the levers.
Is it Andrew Fisher's machine? Do they memorialise him there?
They do. It's been a while since I was there, but I think it is one of the mines that he worked at, yeah.
Was he involved in the creation of the Labor Party in the 1890s? Or
he was, well, in Gympie he was, yeah, absolutely. And, he was involved in all sorts of organisations. His father, back in Scotland, had been a very community-minded person involved in a whole range of different things, and Andrew Fisher followed his example in Gympie, so involved in political, cultural, union organisations, so became very well known.
He describes himself, and he was unabashed about this because calling himself a socialist, as he did back then, didn't have perhaps the connotations it does today, where it seems very sort of like extreme. But what were the bases of his socialist beliefs? He was quite a strong Christian, wasn't he? He was influenced by sort of Christian socialism rather than that sort of Marxist-Leninist socialism, which of course it was, after this time.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a communist.
No.
And socialism is a wide gamut of beliefs, and he was, I guess, on the centre of that. Believed in a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, believed in allowing people to get ahead. So getting away from England with its fairly rigid class society still. Australia seemed, as you said, to be the land of milk and honey, a place where people could get a fair wage and work under decent conditions increasingly. And that's the sort of thing he wanted. He wanted protections for workers. He wanted workers to be able to get ahead. He wanted a breaking down of class structures in Australia, which sort of were still there based on wealth more than anything else. So, yeah, it's sort of an optimism, really. And Australia offered hope where Britain was still struggling.
Yeah.
In terms of workers getting ahead, and there was no Labor Party in Britain at this stage.
His early political experiences, I mean, even in Scotland, were around the right to vote, around suffrage for miners. Obviously, moving on from the landed gentry just having the right to vote. He wanted every man to have the right to vote. Was that something that he felt sort of liberated from and was, I guess, attractive in Australia? That sort of that it did offer everyone had a right to vote,
including women.
Yes, even
and
women.
And he was an early feminist. I mean, that's not really recognised. But when he went back to Britain as Prime Minister in 1911, his wife marched with the suffragettes. She was a really strong person in her own right, politically, and he was really disappointed that the Labor Party didn't have women MPs, and he was always calling for it.
Tell me about his early forays into politics then in Australia.
Yeah, well, first of all, there was no national parliament when he first started, so it was all about federation in the 1890s. And he became involved in the Queensland Labor Party and got elected to the Queensland Parliament and was, for 6 days, I think it was, a member of the Labor government in Queensland before it got tossed out. It was very much a minority government.
I think that was the first ever Labor government in the world, wasn't it? And then Chris Watson's federal, when he was the Prime Minister, he then becomes the first Labor Prime Minister in the world. So these were early days of Labor in power, weren't they?
Yes,
very much.
But still very much state.
Yes.
And so he's very much becomes a pro-federation, pro the Constitution, even though it wasn't what the Labor Party wanted.
So that was unusual to have that position as a Labor person, a Labor politician, because they were pretty much opposed to the Constitution, seeing it as sort of pro-landowners' rights, didn't they?
Yeah, well, it was very restricted in what the National Parliament could do. And, the states were very reluctant to hand over powers to the federal government. So he was a nationalist. He wanted to create a nation. And that's how he should be remembered. And Deakin was as well, in a different political way, but he was all about nation building as well. So those two figures really dominated the pre-war period.
Tell me about the qualities of his nationalism, because nationalism back then in that pre-Federation, early Federation period, very different from our understanding these days. And of course, this is prior to World War I and World War II, where nationalism becomes, the sort of legacy of that is it's a bit of a dirty word. But he wasn't born in Australia, of course, but a lot of people were born in Australia. It's a new country. They had a sort of quality of pride in their nation, trying to make themselves distinctive within the auspices of the British Empire.
Yes, I think partly because he was Scottish, so he was
not English. He was Scottish.
Yeah, absolutely, and he identified with Scottish rebels, right? So that gave him a particular cast on the British Empire. But nevertheless, he realised that Australia depended upon Britain for its defence, but was very anxious to make Australia self-reliant as it was possible to be. But of course, coming from Queensland, and particularly once he becomes Prime Minister and travels around Australia, he sees how absolutely empty it is of people. So a lot of his political energies are directed not only towards defence, but also in building up population, in encouraging immigration, encouraging the birth rate as well. So he wanted to fill Australia up. He wanted to defend it. He was a supporter of white Australia because he didn't want the sort of blight of slavery to be visited upon Australia. And when he first arrived, he came via Thursday Island, which at the time had a lot of Japanese pearl divers there. In fact, a majority of the population was Japanese. And, that was the rising nation of the Western Pacific. So very anxious about the presence of Japanese in Australia, very anxious about the presence of Pacific Islanders working in the cane fields in Australia.
What did he see as a threat from the Pacific Islanders? I mean, you can understand Japan. And
he saw it as a threat to working conditions.
I see.
They would undercut the conditions of workers. He wasn't racist in the sense that if Pacific Islanders were here for some time and they'd established themselves, they had families here, they could become Australian. But he didn't want loads of Pacific Islanders to come here and work in virtual slave-like conditions in Australia.
Do you think his migration to Queensland and his time as a Queensland MP and then obviously a federal MP, having that sort of northern perspective, do you think that made him more concerned than other politicians of the era about Australia's vastness and vulnerability to threats from the north?
Well, Deakin was as well. They were very much of the same mind, but they had a different approach. It's sort of, we have parallels at the moment with AUKUS. This idea that we can rely upon America and America will be there if we need them. And Deakin was very much, we can rely upon Britain and we've got to make a contribution to imperial defence. So we need Australian cruisers that can fit into the British Navy, a British naval fleet that will come and defend us. Whereas Fisher was a bit more sceptical and looked at the experience in the Pacific where the Japanese torpedo destroyers had defeated the Russian fleet in 1908, I think it was, and wanted Australia to have equivalent ships so that we could defend our shores ourselves if needs be. He didn't believe necessarily that a British fleet would come steaming over the horizon. So very prescient about that in terms of the Second World War.
Yeah, indeed. Tell me about his journey to the Lodge, because he's the fifth Prime Minister, and our Prime Ministers then were pretty short-lived, weren't they, and repeated too, as Andrew Fisher did on 3 occasions.
Yes. Nobody had a majority, no party had a majority in the Parliament, in both houses or even in just the lower house. So it was all a matter of building alliances, so Watson did it. And then Fisher did it with his first government in alliance with Deakin, but then found that he couldn't really trust Deakin to do the right thing. Even though there was a media minds on so many different issues, there were big gulfs between the two. And so he pulled the plug on Deakin and then came in as a minority Prime Minister and had the plug pulled on him, but then was elected as a majority Prime Minister, so a majority in both houses of Parliament, which was an extraordinary thing. And that really should be the thing that is memorialised rather than the Queensland Labor government or Watson's very weak minority government, very short term as well. So here you have Fisher in charge of the first socialist, so-called socialist, democratic socialist government in the world, in power for the full 3 years and able to do so many different things.
Yeah, with a majority in both houses. I should correct myself, actually. It wasn't, of course, the Lodge back then because the Parliament was in Melbourne. But yes, the theoretical Lodge, I should say.
Yes. So he can do all sorts of things, but of course constrained by the Constitution. So big things that he wanted to do as a Labor Prime Minister, have control over commerce, have control over industrial relations, things like that, were powers that were retained by the states. So this is when he tried to bring in referenda proposals that would give those powers to the Commonwealth government. So he was very keen on increasing the powers of the Commonwealth and subsuming the powers of the states. But of course, as we know, the history of referenda, he didn't know it at the time, how unsuccessful they would be and how easy it is to create opposition. So he had the irony of Labor state premiers coming out against him and organising campaigns against his referenda proposals on state rights grounds.
As a federationist, but as a Labor man, do you think he was naive then? Because he's supporting federation and the draft constitution, but with a view that once he gets in and Labor gets in power, the constitution could be changed to reflect the socialist interests, the interests of the people rather than the property owning classes, and that this would all be dealt with later. So let's just support the move to federation and the proposed constitution and get it out of the way so we can be, proud Australian nationalists.
Yes.
There was a naivety there, wasn't there?
Well, there was a great sense of optimism there. That the working... I
guess the semantics, is it optimism or naivety? Naive optimism or optimistic naivety?
In retrospect, you can call it naivety.
Yeah.
But I think there was this incredible optimism of the immigrant coming out, making good, Australia would make good, and simply that the working class was the majority and that the Labor Party would be the natural party of government. And over time, and he hoped obviously it would be sooner rather than later, that the constitution would be changed and the Labor Party would be able to introduce all the programs and policies that it wanted to. But it didn't work out like that because a lot of working people and I suppose lower middle class people, shopkeepers, people who might vote Labor but might vote Conservative, could be enlisted in a campaign against any expansion of government power on the national level for fear that it would intrude on their lives and their livelihoods.
Did he also misread the fact that just because you're in a working class occupation, you're necessarily going to support the Labor Party and the Labor agenda, and that might be an agenda to change the constitution. Was that kind of like a proto-identity politics, or do you think people were very disciplined, and if they were working class in a coal mine, they were definitely voting Labor 100% of the time?
Well, the great majority were, and he did really come undone, at the 1913 election, where he put those referendum questions at the election. So people voted at the election and then voted the referendum questions as well. And the Labor Party lost support as a result. Although they retained control of the Senate, they narrowly lost control of the lower house, even though they won the majority of votes at that election. They didn't win a majority of seats. But nevertheless, undimmed, his optimism was undimmed. He just saw the majority of votes and figured that the Cook government was illegitimate because it only had, a bare, just short of a majority of votes. And he soon forced it to a double dissolution and then got back into power.
You said in his first term as Prime Minister in government in coalition with Deakin, Alfred Deakin, he ended up sort of being let down by Deakin and didn't trust him. I mean, what was the nature of their relationship? Because there were things on which they agreed, weren't there?
Yes, I mean, they agreed on an Australian Navy, and Deakin was, fairly nationalistic, but...
They agreed on White Australia, obviously.
Yeah, everyone, practically everyone agreed on White Australia, although it meant different things to different people. So for some it was a racial thing. A lot of people it was a racial thing. For the Labor Party or people like Fisher, it was about protecting working conditions, that Australia had this chance to be a great laboratory for the world, really. And people from Britain and other places came out to look at Australia, to examine its social legislation in that period prior to the First World War. So there was an incredible amount of optimism, incredible amount of engagement, political engagement as well. Fisher would have huge meetings, a bit Trumpian really, because he would talk for hours. He'd have meetings that went for a couple of hours. He would talk in this real thick Scottish brogue, which I guess a lot of people understood, but it wouldn't go down well today.
No, I mean, there have been in contemporary politics politicians with thick Scottish brogues.
Not quite as thick as Fisher, apparently.
He did have, in that, I guess, that 1910 election, after sort of dumping Deakin, he had a great belief in Labor that everyone was a socialist in Australia and that everyone should support Labor. I mean, was that the reason for that election victory, do you think? This optimism he has, this amazing, I guess, commitment to a program of policies, of workers' rights, of nation building.
I think once the referenda questions were out of the way, and people weren't confronted with that idea of a national government taking an inordinate amount of power over economic activities, and people just judged him on what he'd done already in terms of social legislation, in terms of things like maternity allowances, maternity allowances that were designed to reduce the infant mortality rate, but were extended not only to married women but to unmarried women, which was a really radical thing to do at the time. A lot of people wouldn't have liked that, but he was very insistent on that. But this idea of creating the idea of a nation, so a new coat of arms, instead of having Advance Australia on it, he said we're already advanced. People from all around the world were coming to examine Australia, so he just wanted Australia on it. He wanted blooms of wattle on the coat of arms, and the states also represented on there rather than English symbols. And similarly, introducing an Australian currency with Australian scenes of development on there.
Yeah, I mean, these are things we, of course, in 2025, of course we have Australian symbols and, our coats of arms should represent Australia, not another country. But that would have been fairly radical at the time, moving away from empire.
I mean, putting a kangaroo on the postage stamp rather than the king's head, that would have, caused some people to choke on their toast in the morning, I would think.
and of course the choice of the location of the nation's capital that would subsequently be developed, but the name that is an Australian name, not a British name. We didn't call the capital, I don't know, Edwardstown or Georgetown or yes. Albertstown or
yes.
Charlestown. Yeah, we called it Canberra.
Yeah, absolutely. So all those sorts of things, and of course you'd be familiar with Australia House and the decoration in there. And he was most insistent on that it should all be, Australian emblems represented in Australia House. And also, rather than having Australia House in amongst New Zealand House and South Africa House, down near Trafalgar Square, it should be somewhere separate, up in the city, on the Strand, in a prominent place, on its own little island almost. It was all about, saying that Australia was this special place and telling people that we, had a separate national identity, separate from English and British identity. But then, of course, it all comes crashing down in 1914.
So tell me about the march towards World War One. This is obviously a period of great global turmoil, and Australia is part of the empire. There is, I guess, an expectation that it'll be part of a war effort, contribute troops, but these were contested issues, and it was obviously the conscription debate becomes a massive issue, and Billy Hughes leads the charge as we'll go on to discuss. But Fisher was quite, I guess, tortured about all these issues, wasn't he?
Yes, Fisher had opposed participation in the Boer War, and one can only wonder what would have happened had he won the election in 1913. And he'd been Prime Minister in 1913, rather than being opposition leader and the election happening as the world descended into war. And then he faced the problem, very keen to get back into power, but, Cook as Prime Minister, as the sitting Prime Minister, is expressing support for Britain, offering 20,000 men to be sent as an expeditionary force to the British war effort prior to the war actually starting. So this is the context in which Fisher then says, the Labor Party will support Britain to the last man and the last shilling, having no idea of what was going to come, of the horrors that were awaiting the world. He makes this incredible commitment. When, of course, at a time when people thought the war would be over by Christmas, and that this commitment was great for Britain, a great morale booster for Britain, and would help, the Labor Party establish itself during the election campaign. But hopefully, he could have no idea that it was going to end in 60,000 Australian dead.
At the time, a young John Curtin was involved in the Labor movement. I mean, he was opposing Australia's commitment of troops to World War One. I mean, he was an appeaser just through his career. I mean, obviously a World War II Prime Minister from 1941. But do you think Fisher had a strong sympathy for John Curtin's point of view here, and just sort of by virtue of the politics of the day and the impending election just had to go along with it?
Yeah. I would quibble the idea of Curtin being an appeaser. It's not appeasing not want to be involved in distant wars. He's not Chamberlainite in that sense. And whether Fisher sort of secretly agreed with that sort of sentiment, it's hard to know. I mean, the fact that he was against Australian participation in the Boer War suggests that he might have had, some sense of it. But we'll never know. I mean, we'd get a much clearer sense had he won that 1913 election and been Prime Minister and pronouncing as Prime Minister and communicating with Britain in 1914 as Prime Minister. Instead, by the time he becomes Prime Minister, the die is cast. He's got that so memorable commitment that he made and from which he cannot retreat, and of course which Billy Hughes wants to give practical meaning to in terms of as many men as Australia can produce and as much money as Australia can provide.
And he had said, I mean, I think you have this in your book, in 1909 he'd told journalists that it takes a stronger man to stand against a hysterical wave than it does to go with the current. And you imply that he wasn't the stronger man on this occasion, that he did go with the current and Cook's, the Prime Minister at the time, Cook's provocations to Fisher and I guess with a sort of a view to driving a wedge in Labor between the sort of Curtin point of view and the Fisher point of view, whether to commit troops or not. And obviously Fisher falls on the side of the Prime Minister on this occasion.
Well, very difficult in the context of an election where you're so convinced that you're going to be re-elected, but everything could fall to pieces if you don't sort of follow the popular sentiment in terms of supporting Britain. So Fisher does it and then finds himself in the terrible position of having to implement that statement that he'd made and provide the troops who then troop off to war, troop off to Gallipoli and experience those terrible things.
He wins handsomely at this election, of course, and defeats Cook, who's only Prime Minister for a short time. So tell me about that experience as Prime Minister for that third and final time. I mean, obviously Gallipoli is a very significant moment in his prime ministership, and it, in the telling of that story, and Australia is obviously so far away from Turkey, from Anzac Cove, and doesn't really know what's going on with its own troops, but there's also a sort of sense that we weren't asking questions, were we? No,
and he's got Hughes breathing down his neck as well. Hughes is very ambitious, wants to become Prime Minister himself, and feels himself to be much more a war leader than Fisher is, which is very true, of course, in terms of going all in, boots and all. If you wanted that sort of leader, Hughes was your man rather than Fisher. So Fisher was constrained, I think, simply by the war enthusiasm of Australia at the time.
And why do you think there was such enthusiasm? You paint a picture of a young Australia with nationalistic sentiments. Fisher has been absolutely instrumental in establishing the Australian Navy, getting our own battleships. Very concerned that we have an ability to defend ourselves. Because as you were saying earlier, the British might not get there in time in order to defend us, that we needed to develop our own army, again, to defend ourselves. And yet this is a nation then that gets caught up in a European war very, very quickly.
Well, partly the links between Australia and Britain, the personal links that people have. So many people had been born in Britain. They're English or Scottish, Welsh, whatever. So very much patriotic. My grandfathers both went off to war pretty much as soon as they could. And there's a sense also that if Australia doesn't support Britain, you've got this rising nation of Japan and fears about China. There'd been a war in China just 10 years or so before, in which Australia had been involved. That Australia was very much out on its own in the Pacific. Deakin had tried to cope with that by encouraging the Americans to have some sort of links with Australia. But that was way before the Americans wanted to do anything like that. They'd send the ships over to visit Australia, but there was no ANZUS treaty or anything.
No,
like
and they
that.
were very much more in isolationist mode at that time too.
So Australia had to rely on Britain.
Yeah.
So they couldn't afford to let Britain be defeated in the First World War. And Fisher, though, I think it broke him, as a Prime Minister and as a person. And at some stage during this period, by I think 1915, the earliest signs of the dementia that would eventually kill him, I think, are starting to be seen. He spends a lot of time at home, a lot of time in bed.
In New Zealand?
It goes off to New Zealand as well. Yeah.
Tell me about Gallipoli and his role in that.
Well, he'd basically given carte blanche to Britain, not realising, of course, what was going to happen. Nobody sort of could foresee, the horror that was to come. But, this was Australia proving itself, and I think he felt that he wasn't getting the whole truth, which is why he sent Murdoch to Gallipoli to see for himself and to report back to Fisher, and of course then Murdoch reports to the British government as well, which causes Gallipoli eventually to be abandoned as the lost cause that it always was.
Is it the aftermath of Gallipoli with the returning of the troops from Gallipoli, the Australian survivors, the Anzacs, and obviously stories of great bravery, but stories of great loss that really rocks him? Or is it just that combination of, declining mental acuity, declining health, and of course then the breathing down the neck of Billy Hughes, who wants to take the leadership, and that inevitable discussion, debate and political battle that happens on conscription because people just aren't signing up.
Yeah, I mean, conscription is one of the big things because Fisher wasn't in favour of it, but Hughes was. Hughes was all for pushing for conscription and sending as many men as possible to the European front. But I think it was partly his political troubles as well that he knew Hughes was after him. Hughes was a very troubled man himself, health-wise. He was always going off on retreats to try and recover his health. But he was very ambitious. He wanted to take over from Fisher. He wanted to lead a very gung-ho war party, which the Labor Party wasn't. The Labor Party was very divided on the war and how much it should participate in the war. And Fisher is also conscious that he is financially extended. He's bought this huge mansion in St Kilda, a dilapidated mansion. He has his own cow out the back in order to cut costs. But, he's got his chauffeur-driven Renault car and he's in great debt.
A lot of children too.
And 6 kids to support who are growing up, need to be educated and all the rest of it. If he loses the Prime Ministership and the income that goes with it, he would be financially, in straitened circumstances at best and maybe bankrupt. He would have to sell his house and move elsewhere, move down market, as it were. So this gives Hughes, of course, the opening, suggesting to Fisher that he could become High Commissioner in London, which would give him security of tenure, would give him a very well-paid job, would send him back to Britain. His kids could go to British schools. So I think he may have, to some extent, sold out for a penny. I mean, I don't think he could, his nervous health wasn't going to sustain him as Prime Minister.
Does the fact that he elects to go to London as High Commissioner in the middle of World War One, ceding the leadership to Hughes, who he disagreed with on a fundamental issue of conscription, for his own material gain, does that sort of undercut his legacy?
Well, I think he could foresee that he was going to lose the Prime Ministership, and he also, I think, felt the onset of dementia. He witnessed Deacon's dementia and tried to help Deacon by sending him on a mission to California, because this is before Alzheimer's. I think it was 1912 that Alzheimer first gave a name to the dementia, and people believed if you go on a cruise, it was just sort of a nervous breakdown, and you would recover your senses. So he'd seen it with Deacon, sent him off to California on a mission, but of course Deacon didn't return recovered. And now he's seeing the same early symptoms in himself and being under a lot of pressure from Hughes and just making those decisions about the war. I mean, these are not the decisions that Fisher signed up to make as Prime Minister. He was a nation builder. He wanted Australia to have the means to defend itself, but he didn't see himself as a war leader defending Australia in Turkey.
And if you draw a comparison between Fisher and, say, John Curtin, I mean, John Curtin dies in office, of course, and it sounds like Fisher, if he'd stayed, possibly would have met the same end. I mean, does it show John Curtin to be made of sort of tougher stuff, that he was able to withstand a lot of the pressures of being a war leader that Fisher was finding so very difficult to withstand?
Look, Fisher had already been Prime Minister for so long, and that entailed so much work, so much travelling, travelling on ships, trains, horseback around Australia, having huge meetings, election campaigns that went for 9 weeks. Imagine that.
I guess news travels pretty slowly back then, though, so maybe it wasn't so bad as it sounds.
Well, it travels fairly fast by telegraph and in newspapers, and you'd have huge newspaper articles giving his speeches verbatim. So people, got the news and it went around. But he went and faced meetings of thousands of people and was continually travelling around Australia and travelling, as you mentioned, to New Zealand, but travelling to Britain as well. And I think the strain of that, for somebody who'd risen from the ranks of the coal miners...
you couldn't say he wasn't made of tough stuff. I mean, starting in the coal mines at 9, self-educated.
No, but his health was failing.
Migrating to Australia, becoming... Labor Prime Minister, all extraordinary achievements, and yet modern Labor really ignores him.
Well, Australia ignores him as well.
Australia ignores him. But the people in Australia, you'd think, would pay him his dues, do ignore him.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? Do you think it's the taint of being associated with Billy Hughes, who's the Labor rat?
I think that's it entirely. Really.
Right.
People have forgotten, in a way that the Liberals, do lionise Deakin. The Labor side needs to lionise Fisher because they are, of equal political stature. But if you went round down Bourke Street today and spoke to 1,000 people, you'd be lucky to find one person.
It must have also affected his enduring legacy, the fact he dies in England, and obviously of dementia or Alzheimer's, so he's not there to kind of write his memoirs or promote his own legacy. And so that sort of distance from Australia. I mean, his remains aren't even brought back to Australia till the 70s?
I can't recall. But yeah, that's true. I mean, there were 3 biographers who started writing a biography of him but died before they could complete.
You must have been a bit worried, David, when you started your project. Was this the curse of the Andrew Fisher biographer?
Yeah. So, or maybe I was the 3rd, or I'm not sure if I was the 3rd or the 4th. But yeah, that was a worry. I worked with a will to complete this book. But so that sort of militated against the Labor Party embracing him in a way. Had one or both of those books come out earlier, people would have had a much greater sense of who Fisher was and what his great achievements were. But unfortunately that didn't happen. But even after my book came out, I was very conscious that it had been 100 years since he'd been in power and still no book. So, 1908, when the book came out, was 100 years since he first became Prime Minister. But nevertheless, even with that book, maybe people don't read books anymore.
Well, do you know what? They listen to podcasts.
Yes, so. I know. I feel very modern now.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light and talking to us about Andrew Fisher, a really important figure in our history, in our pre- and post-Federation history, but also in our, I think, in our nation-building story too. So yes. It's a really important discussion. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Georgina. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.